If you've come along, hi, it's Susan Wanmer here from NENA, and if you've come along today to our webinar on what's missing in your life and how a new economy can fix that, if you have come along because of the what's missing section of it, then we're going to go through it logically as to how the current economic system creates that sense of something being missing. We've just started recording, so I got thrown off track there. What was I going to say about that? Something missing. Yes. And so we'll be encouraging you through it as we go through the different sections today to actually be thinking through that filter as well. Like, why did you come and what's missing in your life? What do you feel is missing? And we will cover that more explicitly as we go.
Thank you, Susan. So without further ado, I might introduce our wonderful guest speaker this evening, Ted Trainer. Now, Ted is the author of the book, or he's the author of many books, but the one that we're particularly focused on this evening is called Capitalism, Why We Should Scrap It. And Ted has a brilliant history. He's taught for many years in the School of Social Work at the University of New South Wales, written many books and articles. He's a great thought leader on all things sustainability, economic systems, and pathways to a more equitable and ecological sound society. And I'd love to just hear from you, Ted. A couple of people in the chat have already mentioned that they've been to your place, your educational site, which is, I believe, a geographical site called Pigface Point. So I'd love to hear just a little bit about what Pigface Point is, and your current work that you're doing there.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. Great to be here. I think it was about 1985 we began taking visitors through, looking at alternative ways, not just technologies, but ideas. And I brought students out from my courses and so on, and we had school groups and others. We got to the stage where we were having about 1,000 a year coming through, but we've since had difficulties with the council over access, so we're not working as well as we'd like to. But my courses were always focused on the big picture between the global situation, the role of capitalism in it, and its role as a cause of all our big problems, and the examination of possible alternatives, and the argument that there is no alternative but to degrow down to community size organisation for most of our activities. You can still have big things like a state, but it wouldn't have anything like as much to do as it has now. But we're talking about smaller communities running their own affairs largely within guidelines that apply to the whole nation, and being in control of their fate for a change. Whereas at the moment, of course, we are so passive, so cut off. Look at the average neighbourhood, for example, and you can see wall-to-wall houses full of people who don't even know who's next door, let alone have any role in organising and controlling and discussing their own affairs and problems, let alone getting together to take action. So
Super.
the big scene is about reversing that and getting that control back down to the local system.
And we're looking forward to going through this with you today in the 80 or so minutes that remain. Just a reminder to everyone who's attending live, not listening to the recording, we will have a bio break just after the hour. And thank you for that summary of what Pigface Point, your physical location, is about, Ted. Really appreciate that. And you've used the word capitalism, and I'm really aware that some people may not be familiar with the term or may not understand what capitalism is, or they may think, like some people I spoke to this week, who think that capitalism is just how it is. There's no way to change it. There's no way to have any effect on that. So, Tiyana, how would you like us to cover the definition of what is capitalism? What's the best way for us to do that? It's an
Yeah,
important part of Ted's book.
absolutely. And I think it's helpful to just get everybody on the same page and to kind of have the same framing as well, for what we mean when we talk about capitalism throughout this session. Now, I think that one of the best ways to kind of explain it is from Ted's book. On page 11 in chapter 4, he actually gives a really great kind of summary of what the capitalist system is. So I just thought, kind of in my own words, I would relay that to our audience. So
we have no expectation, by the way, that you're looking at the book as we go through, and nor do we expect you to have pre-read it, which we wrote in the emails to you. But we just thought, for reference, this particular title, seeing as Ted's book is called White Trash Capitalism, and because we've kicked off immediately saying something about capitalism rather than talking about what's missing from your life, it'd be really good to tie that into the book. So Tiyana's just going to go through it in her own words, just a really quick definition that you will see in Ted's book as to what capitalism actually is. Thanks, Tiyana.
So the first point is, in a capitalist system or in capitalism, a small number of people own most of the really important stuff. And so a small group of people own the factories, the big businesses, productive land, and all of the large amounts of money that the rest of society depends on. And then those owners will use what they own to make things to sell. And so these businesses will turn investment into goods and services that can be sold for profit rather than meeting our social needs as a kind of first priority. Businesses then compete with other businesses to survive, and companies are forced to compete in markets. And those that can produce more, who they can produce cheaper or faster or at a greater scale, tend to win. And then that pushes all of the others out. And that competition creates a constant pressure to grow and cut costs. And so to stay alive, these businesses have to keep increasing their efficiency, expanding, innovating, and maximizing profit. And most people can't opt out of this system. So the vast majority of people who don't own enough land or resources to support themselves independently means that to survive, the rest of us have to sell our labor to somebody who does. And things like work, land, and even money are treated like things that we have to trade. And so human work, natural land, and money itself are then bought and sold in markets. And what this leads to, or what this creates, is essentially a system where profit comes before well-being. And so decisions about what gets produced, how it gets produced or how much, and for whom, are mainly going to be driven by what's profitable, not by what people actually need, what's fair, or what is going to protect our communities or our ecosystems. And so this is what can lead to so many of the crises that we see in our world today, things like inequality, climate change, ecological breakdown, war, and conflict. And so society doesn't decide on its economy. Instead, we have this thing that capitalism creates called the market, and that's essentially deciding. And so instead of us all being able to collectively decide on what kinds of industries or services or systems that would best support our lives, these outcomes are being shaped by where investors are going to get the highest returns. So that's a bit of an overview of what the capitalist system is, just to frame this conversation. And I'd love to know, before we kick things off and I hand over to Susan, I'd love to know in the chat, what do you feel is something in this current system that is missing from your life at the moment? You know, it could be something like time, connection. That's something that I heard Ted talk about before. It seems like everyone in our neighborhoods today, with our fences and whatever, it seems like there's a big lack of connection. So I'd love to know what you feel like is missing in your life, and feel free to pop that in the chat. And I'll hand over to Susan now.
Yeah, and it can be anything at all. Don't think that because we're talking global economy that it can be something other than I'd like a better car or whatever it might be. It's just, we're talking to all people here. It's really lovely to see in the chat there's two of you who've actually visited Ted's place, Pig Face Point, already, and one of you who's read an article from him, I think it was 18 years ago. So that's wonderful, really good. So we're encouraging you to listen today through the lens of what you feel is missing in your life, which is why we've asked for something in chat. Let me just see if we've got any responses.
People might still be typing.
They could still be typing. I know that in running business courses, pretty much any business course is going to go and try to increase sales for the business owners. And when you ask business owners why, why do you want more sales? They'll always say money, of course. But then if you actually say, well, if you had the money, what would you really want? Without a doubt, in every business course I've attended over the past 10 years particularly, there's only two things people ever want, and they're freedoms. They want more time freedom or they want more location freedom. But freedom is the overarching, deeper, bigger picture thing that people are wanting. I'm just reading the chat here. Some of you are missing community and you'd love to see more collaborative projects and collaborative housing projects. Some of you would like to see products that don't have a built-in obsolescence. Some of you think your life is pretty damn good, like many of us, yes, but you're looking for societal system changes with a life that presents better justice and better equity. There's a chapter for all of that. And some of you are looking for alternative economic systems. New Economy Network of Australia is the great place to be because we represent a lot of those alternative systems. Yeah, and participatory decision-making, effective action in meaningful decision-making in communities and workplace, and a meaningful life as an impactful person. I'll let you read or tell me when to start our section, Tiyana.
Yeah, feel free to kick off your section.
Okay, just doing a time check so we stay on good time at the moment. Excellent. So what I'd like you to do in this section that we're going to have a look at, which is around consumption, our individualistic lives, and the absence of meaning and or belonging in lives under the capitalist system. What I'd really like us to look at is what you've summed up as being what you have expressed as missing in your life, and listen to the following section through that to see whether it answers any questions for you or raises any questions which we can put into the audience reflection section at the end. So a couple of things to think about as Ted is speaking, and this is going to be referring to chapter 5 in Ted's book. But some things to think about would be like, how does consumer culture substitute consumption for purpose? If you think about all the advertising that's creating desire and creating need for people so that people want to go and consume more and more. So how does that culture substitute a sense of purpose in life? Another lens to look through is, in what ways does competition reshape social relationships beyond the market? So that's that competitive versus cooperative edge. And another lens perhaps to think about would be the questions around, why do loneliness and fragmentation persist in wealthy, highly connected societies? For example, in Australia, why is there loneliness persisting in a society that perhaps has what it needs materially? So, Ted, if I bring this over to you, and you'll know your book better than we do, so this is referring to chapter 5. So on the topics of meaning, belonging, and identity outside of being a consumer, what can you share with us around that and around consumerism?
Well, I think you've got to focus on the nature of the system, which drives out all the things you have just referred to, the capacity for those personal satisfactions, and indeed the connectivity, the community. Those things are not just neglected, but they're actually hindered and pushed aside by a system which is obsessed with and only designed to maximise business turnover. So you mustn't be surprised that we find in our personal lifestyles great lacks and absences. But in addition, what's in there are dreadful burdens. It's not just the things we can't get, like company, but the major characteristics of this society are to do with stress, depression, loneliness is there, all the drug and alcohol kinds of phenomena, and the fact that we work far too hard, and that most people in increasing numbers are struggling to cope. Like they report now that there's about a third of Australians who sometimes have to go without food to pay the bills. Now, this is absurd. We're going in that direction of burdens, deprivation, and people realising that the lives their kids will have will be worse than the lives they had. Now, these are consequences of the system we have, essentially because it does not prioritise your welfare or providing for the actions and structures that would facilitate community getting together and so on. Everything is about facilitating more business turnover, which means, among other things, giving the corporate world the favourable treatment it wants to crank up more business turnover. Now, if I go back briefly to that list of characteristics of the system, of a capitalist system, what you have to add there is the fact that it by nature has built into it structures, conditions and forces which drive us in this undesirable direction. And many of us believe, I have no doubt, they drive us towards catastrophic breakdown. So the system cannot turn itself around or reform itself. The most important element in that discussion is simply inequality. There's books, big fat books written now. I'll mention one, and that's Les Kemp's book called Goliath, where he documents throughout a great deal of history the fact that increasing inequality actually destroys eventually the society and indeed whole empires. And my
Ted,
point is that
right,
capitalism has
can-
built into it forces with drivers in that direction and which will not turn around, cannot be reformed. We've got to scrap it.
Ted, that was wonderful. Can you just recap the title of the book and the author for people who may not have heard it? Because that was a valuable little
Yeah,
tidbit there.
the Goliath Trap by
Goliath Trap. Yep.
Les Kemp. Yeah, it's only recently out.
And
But
the person's,
there are a
sorry,
number of others like that.
yeah, that's cool. Can I just get the person's name again?
Kemp, K-E-M-P.
Kemp. Great.
Les.
Maybe someone could put that in chat for those who didn't quite catch it. So, The Goliath Trap by somebody Kemp.
Les Kemp, yep.
Les Kemp, thank you. And we'll
Yeah.
do that throughout. If you're going to mention a book or something like that, it's really valuable if we can give people that as a reference as well. Thank you.
Yes, and I just add that that's a bit heavy, that book. There are many YouTube discussions of coming collapse. Warren Buffett thinks one's on the way. But I mention another heavy bloke, and that is Michael Hudson. He is fabulous on many, many things, including the history of debt and how it has destroyed whole empires as the rich get richer and richer. They're never satisfied. And when they get richer, they get more power. That means they can buy politicians, influence the decision-making, policy-making to favour them. And eventually the whole system is brought down. But again, he's a bit long, heavy and academic.
I had an interesting conversation with somebody this week in preparation for tonight's webinar, and they're a small business owner, and they were a little bit, what's the word? A little bit concerned about my talking about capitalism, all the types of things we talked about. And what I realized is the person personalized it to their business. At the end, they said to me, I don't think people like me or businesses like mine are the issue. I think it's the multi-billionaires. It's the
Well,
big
yes, of course.
multinational thing. So can we just spend a moment on that as well? Because we're speaking about money, we're speaking about the economy, we're speaking about business, and a business could be someone who runs a once a week market stall selling produce or making earrings, or it could be a multinational type thing. So I'd love for us to define almost levels of
Yep,
business.
very important to do.
Yeah, and also when it's Australian and when it's global as well would be wonderful.
That little comment was a very important one. That David Graeber is fabulous on so many things. The book, The Dawn of Everything, just hits you with the fact that Western society has run off the rails long ago with its commitment to domination, power, top-down control, which generates armies, wars, and all the rest of it. And many other societies didn't do that. And his book has lots of examples of, for example, pre-Columbian American societies, which were in many respects terrific because they were not hierarchical and ridden by domination and kings, but were highly participatory. They were indeed anarchist in the good sense of that word, a very ambiguous word. It stands for a lot of things I'm not in favour of, but it also, the classical concept, is about highly participatory democracy where we all participate in making the decisions. Now, back to the structure of business, you must make a big distinction between big business, the Musk end of it, and small business. And the small businessman is typically not a capitalist. His shop, his business is just the tools he possesses which enable him to go to work and sell carrots and make a living. And he is not in the business of accumulating capital to invest to get an income without working for it. Our problem is the big boys who have most of the capital, who do not want to work for a living. They want to invest their capital to get incomes without working, and that leads you all the way down the track to getting control of the political system and getting laws which favour the investment, the policies that you want. So that's an important distinction between the two types of business. And I won't do it, but we could also at this point look at the strata within capitalist society. Below the small businessman is the working masses like you and me, and below that, the dispossessed, the lumpen proletariat, those who have been dumped in increasing numbers. So you've got to have that framework of different levels, and you've got to ask who benefits from all this and where are we heading? It's all getting worse almost by the minute.
I think that's a really lovely distinction and one that I honestly don't hear. It's very refreshing to hear it. People just generally talk business, and even myself, I encounter people, good-hearted people working more in community areas who are quite judgmental of me because I'm a business educator. So they actually see anything that's not community or socially based as being the devil, and anything other than that as being okay. So it's really refreshing to hear you talk about the difference between small and big business as well, and asking who benefits. And coming back to your comment about the average business owner, the smaller business owner or the nano business owner not being part of the capitalist system.
Well, he's part of it, but he's not a capitalist.
Okay, that's the difference because people have
accumulate enough capital to get into the investment game, but many little fellas are just making ends meet and not accumulating capital to live without working.
So a nice other defining point would be around the accumulation of capital.
Oh, yes, of course.
So it's not so much being in business, but it's the accumulation of capital. Would an example be, I know there are lots of webinars or live seminars run on property, for example, and the housing market, full of hundreds and hundreds of Australians who go every weekend to learn how to flip a property, do it up, do renovations, create a property portfolio, and the successful ones own 13, 27, 10 houses.
Yeah, but obviously here, the richer you are, the more you can do this. If you've got capital, you can invest it, and it's basically not very risky. You're going to end up with a good 10% more at the end of the year than you had at the start. And what do you do with it? You don't hide it under the bed. You go and invest that. And now ordinary people, and especially poor people, cannot do that because they can't even make ends meet, let alone scrape together some capital to invest. Now, that's one other illustration of the point I made before, that the system has in it mechanisms and structures which enable the rich to get richer and richer and prevent the rest of us from doing so. So you have to look beyond the personal impact that are making your life less enjoyable than it could. You have to look at the structures, the nature of the system, the dynamics built into it. This is what I want to focus on later as we go on. The system has dynamics, forces built into it, like the accumulation of capital, which can do nothing but lead us in the direction of disaster. So there is a knockout argument that we've got to somehow try and get to a very different system, which just takes existing productive capacity, applies it to existing needs as frugally as possible, because resources are scarce and getting scarcer. So we all have a enjoyable life on the minimum amount of toil. And indeed, I want to argue that we can eliminate work. We can make all the producing enjoyable, partly by craft and small business ways and hobby production. So again and again, I think we come to the conclusion that you've got to look beyond your personal difficulties to the fact that it's a system that's causing this, and more importantly, ruining the ecosystems of the planet.
I think that point of working less is very interesting and also very appealing. And once again, not something I hear much about. So I think you've mentioned it 2 or 3 times already in our webinar. So if I'm looking at this section of the webinar and we're talking about individualism, a lot of people would think that there is a sort of good value in working hard. You know, Australians like to think that we work hard, and that's why people perhaps had houses previously, or in my generation. So the concept of not working as much is fascinating.
Yep.
Could you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, very, very important. And it's an important element in capitalist ideology. We suffer from having taken on board lots of ideas which basically suit capital for us to embrace. One is that work is admirable. It doesn't matter if you're advertising cigarettes. If you work hard, it's admirable. And that is a gigantic myth that works in the interests of the capitalist class. It is, of course, important to work hard if there's work to be done. But in principle, we work about 3 times too hard. We produce mountains of stuff that we really don't need. And more importantly, it's not just the consumption of junk that's the problem. It's the fact that we have systems which are extraordinarily expensive and wasteful and could be avoidable. One of the most important examples is the sewer system. If we live in the way that I will argue for later if we've got more time, the small-scale, local, essentially village-based community, then you can recycle all your food waste directly to methane digesters, compost heaps, and back to the gardens. And you do not need a fertiliser industry, and you do not need sewer mains, because you've got closed loops of nutrients going back to the soil. Now, that's an example of a system change that we can make in so many areas that eliminate the need for extraordinarily wasteful systems. Like if you supply eggs via a supermarket, you need ships in the sea dredging up fish to make into feed for poultry. You need factories to put chickens in. You need chemicals. You need people sitting at desks. You need packaging. You need supermarkets. If you have your eggs produced by local co-ops or backyards, you need none of that. So it's the system change that is the biggest advantage and path to getting new communities with obviously new economies, which are directly geared to meeting local needs in the most frugal way possible. And you get all these side benefits, like you have co-ops and you have community working bees and committees, and you therefore have community. Nobody's lonely. You have animals you can go and talk to. I have a paper on listing the many, many benefits of the villagey way. One of them is that you eliminate warfare. How? because we no longer have to engage in resource wars like Trump is excellent at to secure scarce resources and make sure nobody else gets them. You don't need to do any of that if you live frugally with local systems.
It sounds ideal. I can see Peter Butler in the questions is asking if there was an ideal type of situation available. Ted, I'm just going to circle back to Tiyana because as I flipped my page over looking at my notes, I went to a different section of interest that I've got. I wrote myself prompts here. And so I know I've thrown out my co-host. So Tiyana, where would you like us to pick this up? I know for those of you listening, it makes no difference. And I'm really interested in hearing the depth of your comments in the chat as well. It's amazing. And thank you for being so interactive today. This will only matter to my co-host so that she actually gets to speak her part. What would you like us to do, Tiyana?
That's a really great question because I feel like we've already kind of touched on what I was going to focus on and we skipped your first point altogether. I might just draw upon what some people have been saying in the chat. I think something that Alex pointed out is the idea that, you know, most people are kind of just running on this treadmill, or I often like to think of it as just the perpetual hamster wheel that everyone's kind of stuck in. And a lot of people don't even have the ability to question what's happening around them because we're so stuck in the thick of it. And, you know, I'd love to know if you have any ideas, Ted, for how we can begin to reach those people because, you know, I know so many of us, and, you know, I'm guilty of it, but we get stuck in our little echo chambers where we're constantly talking to people who are kind of similar to us or familiar with us or share our own ideas. And you've been doing this work for quite a while. So in a country like Australia, particularly, I know in the introduction to your book, you talk about how, you know, Australia is seen as one of the best places in the world to live. And at the surface level, for most people, it seems like an okay system. But there are a lot of shortcomings. And I guess some of the absences that we wanted to kind of link that to was this idea of, you know, there is this kind of absence of stability for a lot of people and security. A lot of people, you know, can't even meet their own needs, you know, more than, you know, a couple of weeks out if they're, you know, working a regular job. How do you think we can kind of frame this or get this conversation to reach those people? And how can we get people to, I guess, kind of wake up and realize that the system they're stuck in isn't actually working in their favor?
Yeah, well, it's obviously the big problem. We get nowhere unless we get a very large number of ordinary people to see it as it is and to be very strongly in favour of the alternative ways. I don't have any miraculous answers. Obviously, we need to encourage everyone who's on side, like us here today, to put energy into simply explaining to others whenever we get the chance, dropping the messages in, picking up brief comments that the book shouldn't say, you know, oh, this system's really got to change. It all adds up. The Berlin Wall came down with a crunch suddenly, but an awful lot of talking, dissent, discussion went on before that. And unfortunately, you and I can't see the effect we're having. I've been in the game for several decades, and for a long time, we saw no effect whatsoever. We're now seeing a very rapid escalation in firstly, the discontent with how the system's working, and B, the utopianism, the desire for, the expectation, the willingness to work for change to better ways, and the advent of the degrowth movement, which is only a 20-year-old phenomenon, is a remarkable testimony to that. But in addition to those many contributions we can all make and should, writing letters to the local paper, picking up on issues in the locality that might not seem related, but connecting them to the big degrowth movement and need. In addition to that, towards the end of the book, I've got some ideas about things that community gardens can do to become educational sites. The basic answer is the the notion of prefiguring alternatives here and now. Now, some strategic approaches don't do this. They focus on taking state power and then trying to implement the changes. We are suggesting that much more important than that and effective is trying to prefigure, which is the word the anarchists use, examples, instances of alternative ways here and now through local co-ops, community gardens, etc., to illustrate the ways we're talking about. In other words, the purpose is not so much to get those things on the ground as instances of new ways, but to get them on the ground as educational devices. So our community garden has lots of display boards and information, and it has lots of people ready to pounce on visitors and explain what we're on about. We're not just on about growing carrots, we're on about setting up co-ops that are the first steps towards this locality taking control of its own affairs through the community development cooperative that this community garden is the beginning of. And let me just add that the most fabulous example of what this can become is the Catalan Integral Cooperative in Spain. It has thousands of people all engaged in growing food, distributing, providing legal services, providing medical services, providing an employment agency, and doing it all without any reference to or benefit from the state or the market. And it's a fabulous example of what we can become, and it's not the only one.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example and really well known. And I just have to come back to NENA again. NENA is a cooperative, and it was created as a cooperative for that reason, to help put what a cooperative is out into the world more, and also to help educate people as to what cooperatives are. Can you bring in something about growth? There are quite a few comments in the chat about growth, and I know you mentioned that in the book, and the section that I missed by mistake, I was meant to talk to you about the growth economy because you've mentioned degrowth. So tell us about growth and the economy and capitalism. Can you tie that together for us?
Yeah, for sure. And maybe we should have started because growth is the big problem. We have a world which is grossly over-consuming, overproducing, and the supreme commitment on the part of all the Albos and big gyms down there in Canberra is to increase production and consumption as much as possible with no limit forever. Now, that is not just absurd. If you have any ecological conscience awareness at all, you realise we are grotesquely overproducing and consuming, depleting resources, ruining ecosystems. So it's not just that it is absurd to plunge on in that direction. It is now suicidal. It's ruining the planet. And everybody listening here is going to be very, very sorry about all this in the very short future. The limits to growth people thought that we're going over the peak of all these things and we're going to plunge down the other side, but they weren't precise about time settings. Some of them thought maybe it's 2070 that we go down. In 2014, Ken Turner ran a review and a reassessment and said we're on track to do what the limits published 50 years ago predicted. And only this year we had another major review which said that we're not just on track, but the timescale has shortened to the decade level. They reckon we're into the crisis now, and there's plenty of reason to think that. Cosy is not going to go away. All your costs are rising. All the profits of the big corporations are increasing. Resources are getting scarce. Copper grades mined have doubled in a decade. We're going over the top of the curves, and we're into the descent on the other side, maybe on the early 2030s. Now, nobody knows the timescale accurately, but all of that is a sad comment on the obsession with the commitment to growth. Now, don't expect Albo and Big Jim to do anything about it. They are powerless here. They cannot make the slightest step against trying to perpetuate the growth economy. If they did, they would be instantly voted out of office and locked up as insane. So we've got to do it without them and underneath them. And it's at the community prefiguring level that we get the job done if it can be done. Maybe we'll fail, but it seems to me obvious that's a level where we've got to work. And let me finally say, I think the revolution is going well. It's clumsy, bumbling, fair bit of it's wrong-headed in my view, but it's underway. And for 30 or so years, me and my mates saw no effect for our efforts, but now you're seeing effects.
Wonderful. Tiyana.
I think this might be a good point in the conversation. Just before we have a quick bio break, I think we can shift the focus now to, the questions that everyone has, which is, how can we we've already looked at, I think, where capitalism is kind of taking us, and beginning to explore what alternatives might look like. And lots of people in the chat have asked questions about different alternatives and different potential solutions. So I've got them saved. And what we might do is we'll come back to some of those at the end if they're not addressed earlier. And, I think just to kind of frame the conversation for when we begin to kind of look at what you put forward as your kind of alternative vision for a new economy. Just to frame the conversation, what are some of the alternatives that people see? And, we'll focus on your particular solution, but just to get a feel, what are the potential solutions or alternatives that are currently kind of in the zeitgeist that people see as alternatives to the current system? And how, I guess, can we begin to kind of empower people to pursue alternatives?
Do you want us just to have that as a quick frame and then take the bio break? Is that the concept?
I think Ted can answer that question, and then we'll take a quick bio break, and we'll dive in specifically after the break to your alternative.
Super.
Briefly, the alternative way I spell out in great deal wherever I can, which I call the simpler way. It has about 5 key characteristics. One is small. Most of us would live in small, highly self-sufficient, self-governing, cooperative communities with a focus on living as frugally as possible. Now, it doesn't mean the end of business. You can still have small businesses and farms, but it does mean an essentially community-run, not just economy, but society, like we're in control of their own lands and structures and systems. Lots of committees, lots of commons, commonly owned cooperative property, and lots of working bees. So you need far, far less done by the state. You cut transport and all the other costs dramatically. Let me quickly comment on the people, Rachel and someone else was saying, what effects can you see happening when I was waxing on enthusiastically about us now getting somewhere? Well, firstly, the climate of opinion out there, which you and I are contributing to by simply raising these issues wherever we can, is much, much better than it was. People are thinking about that we need change, and they are thinking about localism, participatory alternatives. Second point, those things are being built. There is a global eco-village movement with thousands of people doing the sorts of things that the simpler way is about. And there is the transition towns movement. Now, I have criticism of both of them, partly to do with being a bit bumbling, but the directions they're in are precisely what we want. We are not going to get to a solution to the mess we're in unless it's via a transition towns movement. We have to convert our existing settlements, our existing towns, to be what I've just described, in control of their own affairs, with their own committees, working bees and so on. Now, all of that is happening at a marvellous pace now. And so you've got the business of just raising the issues wherever you can, but you've also got the opportunity to get involved in something or set up a community garden, which you deliberately intend to become a community development co-op. Unfortunately, most of the community gardens at the moment are only at the level of enabling happy gardening, which is great, but they are sitting ducks to be organised towards being marvellous educational enterprises. So I hope that reassures you that there are grounds for optimism, very much so, and driving it all from here on at an accelerating pace will be the worsening COSI the worsening polycrisis. People are going to be jolted into realise the system is not going to save them, and you're just going to have to get together locally to form your co-ops to help each other out.
Thank you. Do you think we should have a quick bio break here, Susan, and then pick up in
2 minutes?
Yep.
Yeah, I think because we've promised it to people, if we just take 2 minutes, grab a sip of water, or just do whatever you want, and we'll pick this up for the audience reflection section. Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Tiyana. And thank you for all your comments.
And for those who are still on their break, they can come back and join us. Perhaps for a selfish reason, if not anything else, I'd love to echo a question that was asked by Peter in the chat. What's the difference between a break and a bio break? That wasn't the question I was thinking of, but I just saw that. That's a really great question. I think I've heard the term people call a bio break, like, you know, you're either getting a drink or you're going to the toilet kind of thing, like you're sorting out your biological needs in the break.
As opposed to an industrial relations imposed tea break or lunch break. It's just looking after physical needs. Great question.
Usually only like 2 minutes or so. A bio break. That's a great question. So just before Peter asked, and it's a question that I know Susan knows that, you know, I often bring up, and it's the idea that a lot of people we probably talk to, when you tell them that you're against capitalism, their mind automatically goes to socialism or communism. And you're very explicit in the book, Ted, in getting the point across that you don't think socialism is the best alternative. Just for anyone listening and who hasn't read your book, could you just maybe reiterate why that is and what distinguishes your alternative in the simpler way to a socialist or a communist approach, and how we can kind of communicate that to people who seem to just think that the only alternative to capitalism is socialism?
Yeah,
and a quick definition of socialism, capitalism, Marxism, any other isms you bring into it, because people don't use those terms at barbecues and at the school gate. They don't talk about that stuff. So
yeah, very important area to clarify. Socialists are terrific in seeing that the system has to be replaced, seeing all the things we've said about capitalism. The problem is to do with whether or not a centralised state can run the kinds of small-scale communities that I've said must be the solution. There's no, in my very firm view, there is no option about this. The only way you can get those resource costs down and environmental impacts eliminated is through these small-scale, localised communities dependent on their local ecosystems and willing and determined to live frugally. Now, I have detailed arguments supporting that claim, and one of them is indeed a paper we published on the supply of eggs. If you supply eggs to people via the supermarket, the resource and environmental costs will be about 100 times what they'd be if those eggs came from the local co-ops and backyards. So I'm saying we have very heavy reasoning supporting the claim that the alternative must be small-scale local communities. Now, my point here is that the state cannot run them. They must be run from the locality. They will only thrive if they're full of responsible, empowered citizens who turn up to committee meetings and are vigilant and see leaky taps and fix them, and are motivated to, and with pride in their community, to make it a beautiful community. And why are they so motivated? Because their own welfare depends entirely on that outcome. So the incentives are around the right way. You're motivated to participate, to contribute, to be conscientious in running your community, and the state cannot provide that. It cannot enforce it. It can encourage it if it so wishes. But then we come to the next logical impossibility, and that is you cannot get a state enshrined, installed, with this right, correct motivation to support localism unless there has first been a revolution in ideology whereby everybody votes such a state in. You can't get that state to fix things unless you first get in a state that is going to be motivated in the right direction, and that won't happen unless and until you and I have done this difficult work of getting everyone to vote for the simpler way, and therefore to vote for a state that will encourage it. And if we achieve that, the revolution's over. We don't need much from the state because we've got what we want, and the role of the state will be minuscule. It'll be a coordinating agency. It'll propose policies which we take down to the meetings in all the town assemblies to decide on. So it won't have legislative power, and we will make the decisions down at the local level. Now, the Swiss already do that kind of thing. It's called anarchism. It's called participatory democracy. It's theoretically simple, obvious, and highly desirable. All we've got to do is explain to people that this is the only way out of our predicament. And to go back to the socialism thing, socialists are great people. They're well motivated, but I've written several articles trying to get them to see that you've got to come across to be anarchists, not believers in the capacity of the centralised state to do the job. We've got to do it down here below them.
Unmuted. Something that is lovely to hear when you've been expressing that is in the Northern Rivers back in 2022 and 2023, we had the biggest recorded floods in our history in the region, Northern Rivers, New South Wales, and all the work that's been done and is being done on resilience, without a doubt, shows that what will get us through is community. And so everything that you're describing and talking about is what the research, the data, and everything is saying, that we can't necessarily stop the floods happening or natural disasters, but what will get us through is more local, community-based, self-reliant, self-sufficient action and community as well. So yeah, it's really interesting hearing that from you. And
can I reinforce that?
yeah,
We haven't yet stressed the fact that these communities are highly resilient. The society we have now is fragile.
Yep.
Your supermarket shelves will go bare in 2 weeks without restocking. You're out of petrol in something like 2 weeks or a month. Your lifestyle depends on lots of shipping going across the oceans every day, bringing in containers, and etc. It is highly fragile, and that concept is one that supports the collapse thesis. And the reverse, of course, couldn't be more stark, that local communities will have crops in the ground. They'll have just about everyone in the village knows how to fix everything because the technologies are mostly very simple. So we would be able to get by pretty well, even through mega disasters. And the fact that systems are breaking down and being threatened by things like floods is another force in our favour. It's going to, as you've illustrated, Suzanne, make people realise they've got to get together locally to develop their self-sufficient systems.
And Richard put an interesting comment in the chat around cosmolocalism. So to me, that's an ideal way where, for example, we are using technology. So we have to have something outside of my local suburb, local community to do that. But if that falls out of the sky or if that gets interrupted, where we go back to is the earth-based localized
Yeah, and
systems.
those are all there and robust and reliable in most, if not all, eco-villages. They've got carrots in the ground, they've got skills, and above all, they've got the right ideas and motivations and value systems. All the values in our new communities of the kind I'm describing are positive and yield social benefit. They're not just how can I survive as an individual, how can I get rich, but they're how can I make my community thrive, because I know that if it doesn't thrive, I won't thrive. So the new communities require goodness, but they reward it. They reinforce it. So again and again, and I have a paper detailing the benefits of the community way. There's just such a long list of ways in which you get benefits, and it's pretty difficult to find a disadvantage. Those communities have their problems, but one other thing they have are mechanisms for dealing with them. They have community meetings, they have village elders, they have arrangements whereby you can feedback critically without offending and so on.
Yeah, and that answers one of the other questions in the chat that somebody was asking how what you're speaking about relates to Indigenous ways of living and Indigenous economics. And in my very limited understanding of that, those systems and those societies are built on those types of structures that you've talked about.
Yes, can I add to that and reinforce again? We've been very Western, but the third world is getting on with all this at a pace most of you would be amazed at. There are millions in movements, especially in Latin America, in the Campesino, the Zapatista, in India, the Satyagraha, etc. In India, in Africa, the Ubuntu movements, which are doing what we want and reinforcing my argument that the main strategy for many of us is not confronting the state, it is turning away and letting capitalism self-destruct. These people like the Zapatistas are not out to defeat the state or take it over. They're out to do their own thing, to provide for themselves. And one of the most encouraging phenomena is the extent of that in the poorer countries. People are in very large numbers going their own way, doing what, and here's the shame of it, Gandhi said was the sensible path a good 100 years ago. That is small-scale villages, highly self-sufficient, cooperative, not focused on rich world affluence and the rich world definition of the goal of development. There's a great deal of recognition now, and again I've written lots of papers saying the most important thing the third world can do is to completely junk and ridicule the Western model of development, and it's happening a great deal now.
That's encouraging and good to be reminded of those examples as well. Tiyana, we've got 15 minutes left and so many great questions in chat. What are you going to extract for us? I shouldn't use the word extract. Yes, I can.
We're extracting in a positive way. We're not being extractivist. We're just it's just it's a I think something that kind of ties into what we've been talking about. A question that Alison asked earlier that I think is interesting is that she said that there's a lot of movements and groups. The example she gave was Earth for All, which is an initiative of the Club of Rome. There's lots of attempts to try and change the system globally. Do you think that there is space or the possibility to change the system and create this more localized and simpler way of living through global initiatives? Or I'm curious if you think, Ted, that we have to do this at a very grassroots level.
Well, we have to use all the ammunition, to use a bad analogy, we've got. We have to do whatever you think might make a difference somewhere and whatever your resources, capacity, skills enable you to do. Now, we differ greatly in all that, but you can't predict what'll work best. So you just got to do, whatever you possibly can. One of the chats there said that raised the issue, if we start to succeed, capitalism will crush us. Now, there's a good counter argument to that. Capitalism is going to be in a lot of trouble. It is going to have trouble getting the oil to run its armies, and it is not going to be capable of identifying, targeting, and crushing every little village that wants to make its own decisions. So I do not worry about its capacity to wipe us out. When the revolution was and had to be about storming barricades and trying to take the state, then the capitalist class, the ruling class, was able to very easy pick us off and crush us. But the situation is totally different now. The revolution is not going to be primarily fought at barricades. It's going to be fought implicitly in sneaky round the back ways at the community development gardens who have just converted another 2 visitors to the alternative view.
And I just noticed a comment in the chat which brings up something from your book. JP's saying that the stealth co-ops of the past were guilds. And I know that you mentioned guilds and mutuality, the concept of mutuality in your book. Do you want to cover that for us quickly?
Oh, just to say that Kropotkin's book on medieval guilds is just mind-blowing. The way they felt each other to be brothers under intense obligation to look after each other's families and so on. Well, that's what we'll get to in our new villages. And again, let me say, it's not because we're good guys, altruistic and sacrificial. It's because we'll know that it's in our interests to do that. That it's not just that it's rewarding. It's nice to look after each other, but I know that if we don't keep our irrigation systems and our agricultural co-op and our leisure committee and our looking after old people committee in good shape, I'll be sorry. So all the incentives round the right way again. Can I just add in another thing we haven't just talked about? The counter argument to our position is often the decoupling claim. That is, the tech fixers who think the Microsoft people who think that better technology will enable us to separate economic growth from its impacts, its resource and environmental impacts, so we can go on growing while we don't have those impacts and we can reduce them. Now, there are literally hundreds of studies showing that that is nonsense. You can't do that. If you increase the GDP by doing anything, including producing ideas like universities do, you increase the use of resources. So don't let people get away with that one. Another couple of points. The amount of work we do in our new communities will be a small fraction of what we do now. We work far too hard at the moment. And secondly, do not think that we will have to jeopardise high technology where it matters. We'll actually have more resources when we scrap the nonsense of overconsumption and those stupidly wasteful systems like sewers. We will have abundant resources to provide all the excellent healthcare, research and development, better windmill design than we need. So it's not an endangerment of technology, and we're not against high tech. That's fabulous in as long as it's confined to socially beneficial purposes, not the idiocy of Musk trying to put his car into space.
Ted, when you say we, who is the we you're referring to?
All of the people we have and will convert persuade to see the sense and the necessity of some kind of simpler way. My detailed discussion is going to be wrong on some aspects, but the generality I will not back off from. So we have to explore our way to what works for us, and we can't be dogmatic about that at this stage. But as long as we go on winning people over to see the sense of it and the necessity for it, because people in ordinary neighbourhoods and dying community towns shouldn't take much waking up to the fact that they better get into action or they're in increasing trouble.
Thank you for defining that. Appreciate it. Tiyana, how are you going?
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm just checking the chat, making sure we're touching on most people's questions and points. I think a question that maybe hasn't properly been addressed, or we might just address it again. So when Karen asked about Indigenous communities, I think she was particularly asking about Indigenous sovereignty and how you would see Indigenous sovereignty fitting into this vision or this approach, the simpler way. If you could just touch on that, Ted. I'm for Karen, I think.
Well, it's all in there. Any notion of Zapatistas running their own affairs in their own communities fits right in with Indigenous Australian situation. I've agonised for years about the fact that there's almost no discussion that I'm aware of them forming their own town committees to develop high levels of local community self-sufficiency. Now, they're way ahead of us on a lot of this because they've got community and care for each other. But at the level of the gardens, the workshops, the poultry pens, it seems to me there are enormous possibilities that they're all set up to do straight away. And again, it's what's happening in those many third world movements. And again, to go back to the pre-Columbian Indians and so on, they did all this kind of thing. It's all, the recipes are often just there for us to pick up and attend to. Can I jump in on one or two other quick points? One is, in our new communities, there will be no unemployment. Unemployment is a diabolically rotten thing that the capitalist system maintains to provide willing, eager workers in lousy factories. There is no excuse for unemployment. Many people have argued that even within a semi-capitalist society, you can easily get rid of it. Bill Mitchell's written on this for decades. So all we do in our new communities is discuss what our problems are. And one of our big problems at the moment is that lots of people are homeless and unemployed. Well, we say to ourselves, how are we going to fix it? So we set up community gardens with little businesses whereby people work to produce carrots and are entitled to payment in a share of the carrots where we produce, and the eggs and the fish from the fish tanks and so on. So there's a very simple way, which the Catalans have done, of getting everybody who wants a livelihood, very important concept, livelihood, everybody who wants a livelihood whereby they can contribute to community and have self-respect can have a livelihood. Very easily done if you're in control of your local economy. The other quick thing I want to mention is in the book, I have a short chapter on America. Now, if you want to know what's in store for us, where we're heading, read that chapter. America is a rotten society. It's the richest. It is in the list of about 24 social indicators that I mentioned. It is, on all accounts, in the lowest three or the worst. It has double the health costs of the rich country average, and it has a worse health system. So that's where we're heading rapidly now. So please take Trump as having upped the ante, accelerated the pace. He's not an odd thing that's come in out of the blue to put us on a strange new path. He and Musk and the tech bros are taking us rapidly in the direction we're going anyway. So read that chapter and be afraid.
I'm smiling, but I'm not. Ted, you call your approach the simpler way with a capital S, capital W, simpler way. In the 3 minutes, could you sum up for us what the simpler way is? You've been alluding to it during the webinar, but just to give us an idea of what it is.
Okay, the polycrisis and the quasi-live crisis are going to get worse. They are about overconsumption, overproduction, which is what capitalism wants and drives us to. So the answer can only be transition, degrowth to simpler lifestyles, which, let me insist again, means no deprivation whatsoever. We can have perfectly adequate clothing, housing, and high tech. Simpler lifestyles and simpler systems. So the basic elements there are small scale, highly self-sufficient settlements, highly self-governing settlements with overarching national guidelines and rules that we must keep within. But most important is embracing frugality, which means simpler lifestyles and systems. Now, frugality, again, I've written at length on that, is a virtue, is a benefit. We work 3 times too hard. If you live with what's adequate and set your goals as community, having time for hobbies, having time for personal growth, having time to sit in the sun, having time to read books and write books, then being on a simpler track with respect to consumption is liberation. It's not a burden, and that's a major point we've got to get across to the people we're trying to persuade, because at first, degrowth and simpler way can be misinterpreted as hardship and deprivation, and it's anything but. It's getting out of the rat race that's driving us all nuts, causing 1 in 7 Australians to suffer depression. It's our major illness now, and all the other associated social wreckage. So liberation's a word you've got to use.
It puts a different spin on the word frugality.
Yeah.
My parents grew up during the Depression, so I always see frugality as that Depression era and
Yeah, it was then.
yeah, and not much to do with the way you've described it within our current system.
Yeah.
It feels quite abundant when it comes to the freedoms people want. Time freedom, personal freedom. Interesting.
Yeah. And self-respect and pride in your society. At the moment, we have a disgusting society. We haven't touched on the third world much, but our way of life could not be anything like as comfortable and affluent as it is if we weren't looting the third world. Hickel has worked out that every year a net flow of $2.5 trillion worth of wealth flows from poor to rich countries. It's the tantalum in your phone. It's the chocolate you eat without thinking about the slaves who produce it. Now, if we had a fair and just world economy, we couldn't live as affluently as we do.
Beautifully summed up. Ted, one last phrase or word from you before I hand over to Tiyana.
Optimism. Optimism. You do not realise how important we are. We've had 10,000 years of a society driven by tyrants, domination, suffering and wars. The only way out of it is the variety of anarchism I and the Dawn of Everything and so many others are endorsing. And you and I are building it. So just take that on board. How important are you? If we get through, and I think our chances are poor, I'm very pessimistic about our chances, but if we get through over the rubble of the coming collapse, then we have done a heroic job.
Beautiful.
Wonderful. Well, we've got 1 minute to spare, so I think this is a good time to wrap things up and thank everyone for joining us this evening. Lots of praise for you in the chat there, Ted. And just as a reminder, I will be sending a link to read Ted's book, Capitalism, Why We Should Scrap It. Or as somebody said to me the other day when I was talking to them about this webinar, and I was trying to make the point that there's more alternatives than just socialism, and we don't really know what's going to come after capitalism, but it's got to be better. And they referred to whatever comes next as scrapitalism. We're going to scrap capitalism and let whatever emerges emerge. So I like the term scrapitalism.
We are going to add that to the Nenosphere glossary.
Yeah, to our glossary of terms. So I'll be sending a link after this so everybody can read Ted's book if you haven't already. It's a great read. And you mentioned, Ted, at the very start of the book that you wrote the book with a younger audience, like students in mind. And I think it is a very accessible book for people who aren't super familiar with this stuff. So I definitely recommend anyone listening who has, whether it's a young person in their life or just somebody who's at the beginning to question the economic system around them and how it's linked to the polycrises and how it might be disempowering, definitely let them know about Ted's book.
You might also put a link to the web page because all my stuff's there.
Perfect. I'll make sure that's sent to everyone in the email. And thank you so much for joining us this evening, Ted. It's been wonderful to just get a tiny little insight of your great wisdom and the body of work that you've been working on for many decades.
Congratulations to you for organising and to NENA.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for that word of optimism. That feels wonderful. And for those of you listening, whether live right now or whether you're listening to the recording via YouTube, if you'd like to have more optimism and if you'd like to know more about what's going on in the world and then solutions or potential solutions to it, and you're not already on the NENA mailing list, that's the New Economy Network of Australia, then please join. It's free to get the newsletter and we don't bombard you with useless stuff. And it's very cheap to be a member. And I think it's $30 a year or something like that. But when you are a member of NENA, you can actively contribute. And we have hubs, for example, Localization Hub, which is something that Ted talked about, not the hub, but localization as a movement, and many others as well. So check that out, and we'd love to see you as members or readers. And also we just welcome everyone, because all of us who are here today and speak and work voluntarily with NENA are passionate about better lives, better worlds, and the type of society that we all seem to want to inhabit.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to